Here we go. My name's Todd.
This is Cathy.
Welcome back to another episode of Zen Parenting Radio. This is podcast number 719. Why listen to Zen Parenting Radio? Because you'll feel outstanding. And always remember our motto since I think the very beginning, which is the best predictor of a child's well-being is a parent's self-understanding. On today's show, we have an old friend named John O'Sullivan. Hey, John. John was one of our first kind of professional friends we made. Isn't that right, sweetie?
Yeah, I think we were at like one of our first professional dinners in LA.
That's another podcast, but that was an interesting night. So, John, I could either read your bio, which I think would be lame and boring, but just tell the listeners who you are, what your expertise is, and then we'll jump into it.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's great to virtually see you guys again. It's been too long. That was the beginning of what I do now as well, way back then. So these days I run an organization called Changing the Game Project. Also host a podcast called Way of Champions, and I feel so lame because we've only done like 330 episodes. So compared to you two, we're nothing. But yeah, so basically my organization, we do consulting in parent education and coach education and athlete and team development, leadership development throughout sports. So we work with everything from clubs and schools to universities and sport governing bodies. And yeah, I've written a couple books, and I guess we're here to talk about one of them today, but it's always such a pleasure to talk to you two. And the work you do is just amazing.
Thanks, John. Name of the book is The Champion Teammate, Timeless Lessons to Connect, Compete, and Lead in Sports and Life. And here's my thing. I am guessing that there might be some parents out there like, sports, not my thing. My kids don't do sports, blah, blah, blah. Like, I want to frame this conversation not through a lens of sports, even though it will just seep into it. I think of me, because the way you write it, John, with your co-author, who sounds like a really interesting guy, by the way, is through the lens of a team. Like, this is for a soccer coach or a football coach. I want to have this discussion through the lens of I am a team leader on this team called the Addams Family, not the TV show. And Cathy is my co-coach. And then my three kids are the players. And I really think almost everything in this book that I read, and I read 90% of it, can be very easily substituted for parenting. And I think that will be as valuable, if not more, than how do we get our kids to be good teammates on their soccer team? Does that sound like a good idea?
Well, and I'll also say, I think that, because I totally agree with you, Todd, I want to do the overview and how this connects to every aspect of our life. But on the other, just flipping that script, what I so appreciated about your book, John, is all the words that you and co-author were using around belonging and resiliency and facing obstacles and how we treat each other and compassion. I mean, I know those words have been thrown around in sports. It's not like it's brand new, but the way you write it put me at ease. I'm like, okay, this is a path we can do. And so it's even on the, if for those of you who are listening just through the lens of sports, and how to support your kids in this process, or, your own team, what you and your author are talking about, it's so foundational just for us as human beings.
Yeah. Well, thank you. What I'd say is Jerry Lynch is my co-author, and got to give him kudos as well. Jerry is a sports psychologist. He's been at it for 4+ decades. When I first met you guys, I had written my first book, and I'd done a TED Talk about creating this environment that would allow kids to thrive in any achievement activity. It didn't have to be sports; it could be school, music, whatever. And one of the biggest pushbacks, I'm a very competitive guy. I was a competitive athlete. I played Division I sports, professional soccer, coached at that level. But people would say, oh, well, my kid's competitive or whatever. So I met Jerry, right? And Jerry at that time had teams that had won, I think, 36 NCAA titles, right? He had won professional championships. He had golfers win PGA Tour events. You know, he had all this stuff, and he was talking about the same stuff. And I was like, wow, like this is it, right? Here's someone who's teaching the same things, and his teams are incredibly successful in competitive sport. So this isn't anti-competitive stuff, or, you know, this is actually what is the root of competition, which is, you know, to strive with your opponent to better yourself. And so, you know, when we decided to write this book, it's because we do this team development work, and because we're constantly working with athletes. And I feel like, you know, and Todd, like, to go to your question, you know, the back cover of the book, the first thing that we write is you're going to be part of teams your whole life, right? Your family, your church, your community, your school, your work team, whatever it is. And whether you're trying to win on the field or chasing a sales goal, teams are teams, and people are people. And so oftentimes, you know, children's first introduction is their family team and their sports team. And in sport, especially in youth sport, we're so rarely intentional about teaching people to be a great teammate. And as you two know, I mean, the world we live in, the messages that kids are getting all day long says exactly the opposite, right? Get what's mine, become famous, become rich, how many likes, how much attention can I draw to myself? And yet that doesn't really play well in real life. And so when Jerry and I were like, we wanted to write the book that we would use with our own teams that we work with, but the same token, we're like, hey, this is a book for, you know, anyone who is a part of a team to understand how can I be better? Because if I'm a good teammate, I'll always be in demand.
Exactly.
Oh,
Exactly.
okay. So first thing is, before we jump into the book, it's called The Champion Teammate. I just want to like quickly remind our audience, if you've shown up recently, we did interview John a long time ago. What was the name of your first book? I forget.
Changing the Game.
Changing the Game. So it's funny, I don't remember the title, but I remember the biggest lesson from that book that I used as a parent. Sweetie, do you remember what that lesson is or no?
No.
It's the words that you're supposed to say that you're supposed to say. It's the invitation that John asks of what you should say to your kids at the conclusion of the game.
Todd says it all the time. I know it. I love to watch you play.
I love watching you play, or I love to watch you play. And that is worth the price of the book right there. I mean, obviously there's so many other nuggets that are valuable.
Wasn't John's book also the let the kid get in the car and don't say anything for a while?
Shut up.
Yeah. We really integrated a lot of
what was
that.
great about that interview was John told us a story about him not taking his own advice.
Yeah. Do you want me to tell that again?
Yeah, real quick.
Yeah. So it was super funny. And I tell this a lot when I give talks, because it's just, you know, as parents, we're not perfect. We all screw up. Like, you know, most of the stuff I write is just things that I've messed up myself. And so, yeah, this was when my son, who was really young at the time, 5 years old, 4 years old, he's playing his first soccer game, and I was the coach. I'm supposed to be this all-star coach. And he walks out in the field his first game, and he goes, yeah, I don't want to play. And I was like, first game, I'm like, okay, hey, fine, no problem. And I coach the game, and we go to practice that week, and he plays with his buddies and it's fine. And we go week 2, and the kids are like, you know, everyone else getting ready to play, and there's a game before, and a bunch of tall adults yelling at kids. And he just goes, I'm not playing. And now I was embarrassed, right? And I was like upset, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm supposed to be the all-star coach. My own kid won't play. He's perfectly happy because he found like a lizard or something over on the side of the field. So he's perfect, right? And so, yeah, we get in the car afterwards, and I'm putting on my seatbelt and driving, and he's in the back. And I'm like, so TJ, and my wife can tell I'm upset. And she just kind of gives me the old karate chop across the chest. And I was like, what was that for? She's like, really, didn't you just write a book about this? Like, and then she was right, you know? And so, yeah, it's a funny thing.
Well, John, I have to ask, what was TJ feeling? What was the bottom line of all that? And not that there was like a one solution, but there's obviously something. It was about the people. Was it about, like, what was it?
Yeah, probably. And if I know anything about, I have 2 kids, right? They're both, there'll be a senior and junior in high school as this upcoming year. My daughter, my oldest, is sort of the jump off the cliff and grow your wings on the way down person. She'll just jump into anything. And my son is very much like, let's see if this is a good fit. And so I was much more like my daughter, right? Try everything, do everything, play every sport, whatever. And so I learned so much about myself raising my son. Because I had to constantly check myself, had to constantly, take a breath, give him the time and space to figure stuff out. And it's funny because I know that, like, if I had pushed him into things, like our family, like we like to ski, and there was times where like, no, we're going, tough luck, right? But if I pushed him into things, he wouldn't have done them. But because we didn't, like, we introduced him and then we backed off, and now he's an avid snowboarder and an avid mountain biker, and we get to do all these things together that if I, said, "Ooh, wow, he swung that golf club well, let's go, next stop, PGA Tour," we're homeschooling, he'd have just quit a month later, and so, yeah. Sorry.
Well, it's funny. So the book, the newest book, has 3 parts in it. Part 1 is connection, which obviously I loved. Part 2 is compete, and then part 3 is lead. And we're going to jump around, but specifically through your example that you just shared, John, regarding you being in the car, in chapter 11, it's don't react, respond. And you have this acronym that I've used. I actually learned it through a Tony Robbins workshop, but E plus R equals O, right? And I just wonder if you can maybe navigate your experience of how it would have been different if you would have used the E plus R equals O in relation to your son. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. And I think actually there's a guy named Tim Kite from Columbus, Ohio, who I believe is the originator of that. And he does a lot of business development and leadership stuff. And anyway, E plus R equals O, event plus response equals outcome. And it's this idea that that your outcome is far more affected by your response to something than it is the event itself. And so in sport, it's a bad call, and now we can choose to react, lose our heads, yell and scream at the referee, whatever, or we can choose to respond, take a deep breath, play the next play, move on, refocus, whatever it is. And so, yeah, I mean, I just think that that's amazing life advice, right? Is that, but because also events are out of our control, right? Competition, that whole section of the book, like what we teach our teams is don't show up to win, show up to compete, right? When you show up to win, the outcome depends on so many things outside of yourself: officials, weather, fields, bad calls. Your opponent could just be really, really good, right? Whereas if you show up to compete, you control that, right? Have I prepared? Did I sleep? Have I eaten? Do I know the game plan? I control my attitude, my effort, all that. And so when everything's in my control, I have much more confidence. I have much more, less stress and anxiety because I own what's happening.
So sweetie, let's bring this into parenting.
Okay.
So I mean, I don't want to gloss over how important this one teeny part of the book is. If we just did E plus R equals O as a parent, and every time our kids walk in the door, something happened out there in the world, it sucks, I get scared and I want to fix or whatever. If I can instead not try to fix and really
respond from a
ground myself, center myself, and then respond from a place of not fixing, but listening and compassion, then the outcome of that exchange between me and my daughter would be completely different. Sweetie?
Well, yeah. And and I'm like tacking this on, this isn't really a thing, but like, equals outcome. And then I would put another equals relationship, because when those accumulate over time, the event plus your response to it, and then the outcome, then that will dictate how your relationship goes. That will dictate whether your children talk to you when they're struggling with something, or when they're not feeling confident, or when they do need support. Because if your response, or I should say, if your reaction is judgmental, or, doubting of them, or blaming, screaming or just so, the emotions are not regulated, or you're not agile with them, then this is where parents misunderstand. They'll say, but my kid knows I love them, they should come to me. But that ERO, if that happens over and over again, where they're getting this feeling of shame or guilt after talking
or
to
judgment
you, or judgment, they know that's in there. They're like, that's not the person I'm going to. I'm not going to go talk to my parents about this. I'm going to go somewhere else. So that's just another part of relationship too, or a part of what you were talking about with teams, is who you are to these people, not just parents, but the coach, the manager. Are you someone that is trusted and dependable, or are you someone that they're trying to avoid?
Yeah. One of my natural reactions and the poor responses.
Oh, please.
But, I just, as you're saying that, I'm thinking, coaching and parenting are very similar.
Oh.
And the one thing that we always talk about is, when I go to coach a team, I always call it the trust bank, right? Like you have to build a relationship that can bear the burden of truth as a parent and as a coach, 100%. And so when you start, right, it's like, think of it as a bank. Your balance is zero. And I think it's so important, and especially as a parent, right, that you're making deposits early on, because you're going to have to make withdrawals, right? And I think as a coach, it's the same thing. A lot of coaches step in and they start making withdrawals, and they wonder why the kids pull away or their families pull away, and there's no trust, right? And so it's the same thing as a parent. And so early on, I remember when I was, coaching, and I was coaching 15, 16-year-olds, and my kids were really little. And, I was complaining to some of the parents, probably because I hadn't slept or, whatever. And they just looked at me like, small kids, small problems, big kids, big problems, and it's always stuck in my head. And I think my wife and I have worked very hard with our children to build that relationship and that trust, so that, when we get the phone call now that at, midnight says, hey, can you come pick me up? I need a ride home. Yeah, there are no questions. Like, yep, we'll be right there. And that's the kind of thing that just, I think is so important. And what I see a lot from parents is they don't make those deposits, and then they can't make the withdrawals. And so they either blow up the relationship trying to make them, or they just say yes to everything, and they don't give kids the boundaries that they need.
So have you been able to cultivate that trust where they call at midnight and you don't answer questions, and they will call if or when they need that support, friends driving drunk, whatever the case is, you and your wife have made enough deposits where that will actually happen?
Yeah, and it has happened, and it happens, and again, we've done it, and if it happened 3 nights a week, now there's problems, right? But if it happens, once every 2 months or whatever, like, okay, well, let's go fix that, and then our kids are pretty open about, well, hey, this is what happened, and thank you for calling us. That was a great decision,
because to your point, a lot of times people weaponize something Cathy and I will say, which is, exactly the example we're talking about. Whereas if your kid needs support, being called at midnight, not asking questions, then, a parent will say, well, what if they do that 5 nights a week? Like, yeah, well, then it's a different situation. But people tend to just, go all in on one thing, and it's never all in, sweetie.
And I was going to say, and I still am like, but it's the same answer, because if my child was struggling with something consistently, I still need that same relationship to have an influence in that possibly very difficult time for them. So I think we really, and this so connects to sports, John, this is why I love these conversations with you, because we so quickly go to this authoritarian or this like rigid or dictatorship mentality of like, well, things are going off the rails, so I am going to rein it in, and no one's going to do this, and we're not going to talk about this. And we go, and I feel like it's very fear driven. And that because we do really run to, like Todd said, if something goes wrong, but what if this happens all the time? And I got a whole, and there's no trust in human beings. And I'm not just talking about our own individual children, but humans, that's not how we're wired. We would like to be successful. If we're struggling, we don't want to be struggling. Like, we would like support. And but it's very fear-based. Like, and I'm sure you find this with, with parents, but also with coaches, that mentality of I've got to keep control versus have relationship.
100%. And I think this whole, growth happens when you struggle, right?
Yeah.
That's when growth happens. And our natural inclination as parents from the first moment is to protect our kids from, right? As soon as they get sick, they're not sleeping, we want to comfort them, right? And I mean, I think that's why like the hardest moment, one of the hardest moments as a parent is the first time you're like, no, I'm going to lay here and let them cry it out and sleep through the night, or whatever it is, and it's like, oh my God. So in all these moments of growth, that's when struggle happens. That's when it's difficult. And as a parent, I think you're always navigating, when do I intervene versus when do I step back and help my kids see, well, what's good about this, right? What's good about your hard teacher, your difficult coach, whatever, versus, oh, something's crossed the line into dangerous. And now as the adult, I step in,
Yes.
because I know better, and so you're constantly doing that. And again, you get it wrong
Yeah.
sometimes as well.
Well,
But
that's what's funny. Parenting is an art form. Like there's no rules. Cathy and I have been doing a podcast for however many years.
13 years.
There's no like, okay, this is how you do it, because there are times when we do have to step in and step into our leadership and maybe exert a little more control. But it's very rare that would happen. Sweetie, what are you going to say?
And I was going to say that's the layered thing here, is just as we are watching our children struggle, or we're trying to figure out when to step in, and we're struggling in the moment as well. Is this the time that I step in? Ooh, I stepped in too quickly,
Yeah.
Or I stepped in too late. And then sometimes you glean lessons from that, like, next time, but really it's not the next time. You may need to do it differently. There is no, and this is the thing about human beings, that there are no hard and fast rules. There's things that we do and that we play with. And I like the word art. You really have to be agile. You have to be an athlete, right?
Well, John,
you have to figure out how to do this.
John said that growth happens through struggle. And
Yeah.
I don't know if this is true or not, but I'm getting to the point in my life where I don't think any learning happens through success. Now, maybe that's not true. Maybe there is some learning, but as we talk about these challenges as being parents, like if we could reframe, whenever I get reactive and my kids come home with a problem or whatever, and I don't do it well, then it's, I could be like, oh, poor me. Or I could be like, this is an opportunity for me to visit this experience through a different lens or with a different energy. So here's my question. Do you think all growth happens through struggle, or can we also grow through when you score that goal, or when your kid tells you that they love you with all their heart, which, still waiting for those types of conversations to happen. Our kids are so self-involved.
They say that to you.
They do.
I
It's
was
just
say, don't throw them under the bus.
It just doesn't happen as often as we want them to as
when
parents.
we're directing them, they're not like, thank you so much for the direction, but they say they
exactly. That's true. So does any growth happen through success, or is it all through struggle?
Well, I think anytime you have success, it's not like, oh, I just won the lottery, right? I didn't randomly pick some numbers and then it happened, right? So if I had success on the sports field, maybe in that moment, right? Usually what happens is validation, right? And that's where I think the coach or the parent can step in, instead of saying, wow, look at you, you're so talented, right? This is when we talk about growth mindset, right? It's like, wow, you've been working so hard, and today it all came together for you. And let's connect where's all the threads of those days when you had tears in your eyes, when you struggled, when you were upset. That's what happened to today. And you can't have one without the other. I mean, we tell the teams that I coach or they work with, like, if you're going to feel the moment of the most incredible victory, you also have to be prepared for those moments of utter heartbreak. One does not happen without the other once you're in the arena in sport and in relationships. I mean, if you're gonna fall in love, you're gonna also get your heart broken.
Well, and along those same lines, you shared, I appreciated this small story in the book where it was talking about learning through failure. and you had an experience in high school, John, where you had a teacher hand you back a paper that you thought you did well on, and you got a big fat F on it. Can you share that story?
Yeah, sure. And so we call these things rule of one moments, right? One person, one comment, one time can change your life. And I don't know that I've ever met anyone who doesn't have a moment like this, from a teacher, a friend, a coach, trusted colleague, or whatever. And so, yeah, that was 11th grade. Brother Jeff Peterson. I went to a Catholic high school on Long Island, and I got a big fat red F on my paper, and I was a good student. I was just lazy. And I said, Brother Jeff, like, there's no way this paper's an F. I know it's better than other people's. And he was like, John, I didn't give you an F based on what they can write. I gave you an F based on what you can write. And this is crap. Sorry, it's a non-explicit podcast. Yeah, I won't use his exact words, but this was the 80s and whatever. And so then he goes, then he grabs my books and he throws them out the third story window and he goes, get out of my classroom and don't come back until you're willing to give me your best effort, because you are a great writer. And that was the first time in my life I ever thought of myself as a good writer, right? That was the moment, right? And I've not only dedicated my books to Brother Jeff, right, who's no longer in the priesthood. He actually is a vice president of a college now, and we reconnected a couple years ago and everything like that. And he had read my books, and he was like, again, here's the thing. He didn't remember this moment. The moment that changed my life was part of his normal day. He had no idea, but this is the power that we wield as teachers and coaches and parents as well. The interesting part about that as well is, I went home that day. I was pissed. I was angry at Brother Jeff and how dare he and whatever. And I remember going home and, complaining to my dad, my dad was, the Irish Catholic from the Bronx and, New York City firefighter. And I just blah, 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 complained. He goes, was he right? And I was like, well, what do you mean? He goes, well, is what he said true? I'm like, well, yeah. He goes, then what are you complaining about? Right. And I think of today, how many parents would have been on the phone with the principal or the board of the school board and fire the teacher. And, and it's like, and it just took my dad to be like, this is struggle. This is an important lesson. Right. And it could have totally been missed if my dad in that moment didn't say, well, was he right?
Well, there's some shock value to how he chose to give you this lesson. And I would categorize challenge your energy. Like, he did something kind of impactful to wake you up.
Yeah.
And my question is, and I don't, Brother Jeff did what Brother Jeff did, and obviously the story ends well. I just wonder if would there have been another way for him to communicate that message to you in a way that would have landed as well? Or he knew you well enough to know that this is the only way you're going to wake up?
Yeah. I mean, I think we have to add the caveat that, like I said, this is 40 something years ago, and I don't know that you get away with that today, nor maybe should you or whatever. But 100%, right? This was a teacher that I knew well. I'd had him before. He was one of those teachers that I'd go and hang out in his classroom, and we were close, right? So this was an act of love. This was not an act of fear or intimidation. This was an act of love, and it's what he knew I needed in that moment. And I think, the art of coaching or the art of parenting is recognizing who's in front of me and what do they need in this moment, right? And do they need a hug, or do they need some, a little discipline? Do they need, that's the art, right? And the best coaches and I think the parents who have those best relationships recognize it. Because even, when your kid needs that nudge or that kick in the pants sometimes, it doesn't mean there's not moments where they just need a hug, right? And just need love and be like, you know what? Like, come here. It's going to be okay. Let's have a bowl of ice cream and we can work through this tomorrow.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I know Todd's got like a structure that he wants to go through. Well, and
I like it like this.
I know I'm bringing this question right in the middle because I'm talking to moms all the time, and their sons and daughters are athletes, and their greatest concern, or the thing that I hear over and over again, and they always are like, do you know a therapist who can help my child because their identity has become completely around sports, and when they get injured, or if they aren't played, or if they're not going to make this team in high school, or if they don't get a scholarship to college, I'm afraid my child is going to fall apart because their entire foundation is built on this identity of being an athlete, which has been very driven by culture, which has been, we have all these good reasons, like, and I know this is such a big part of, what you write about and talk about, the importance of teams, the importance of sports. But when it gets to this point where then a kid doesn't even know who they are beyond it, can you speak to that in any way you want? Like, how do you talk to parents and coaches about identity with kids?
I mean, I think this is pretty accepted. What everything you said is true, right? That many children in sport, and I mean, it could be the same thing around piano, right?
Sure.
Like let's face it, it's not just sport, but that they instead of becoming John, the guy who plays soccer, it's John, the soccer player. So yeah, I get hurt, I get cut, I get whatever. My whole life and the structure around it fails. This has been driven by our society of early specialization and more younger, so that so many kids lose many aspects of their childhood because of sport, right? That it's all about every weekend in the summer is another baseball tournament, and so that's my friend group, and that's whatever. But yeah, it's not super healthy. Now here's the interesting part, right? To truly become an elite competitor, you almost have to lose yourself in it. It requires a level of ruthlessness and selfishness and all this sort of stuff. And that's why we see, I mean, what we now have is lots of pros leaving sport and talking about this issue, right? That they really struggle in transition out of sport, right? Pros get help with that. 15-year-olds often don't.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so it's this really important thing as a parent that we recognize it. Someone, it's really interesting you asked that question, because someone asked me, I got a really interesting email this morning, actually, based on a recent podcast I did. And the question the listener posed was, are some kids addicted to sport?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, are they addicted? And I thought about that, but the question that popped into my head is, are some parents addicted to their kid being in sport?
Yeah.
Right? It's their friend group. It's their thing. When you cut a kid off a team or put them on a B team, you're also removing parents from the people they've hung out with for 4 years. And so I think oftentimes the problem is not with that unicorn athlete who's super focused, competitive, and driven. It's the parent who's super focused, competitive, and driven on behalf of the kid, who could probably take it or leave it, right? And then that sort of, they impose that upon the child, who then struggles a lot of times because they see their mom or dad struggling. Right?
I see this as a cycle often with parents where, when the kids are young and the parents are like, I'm going to help you with this sport. Maybe they played, or they kind of know the scene, or they just really want their kid involved. And then they help them. And then the kid recognizes that as a way to connect with their parent. And they also may like it. Like, this is very multi-layered. And then they come back and ask for help. And so the parent goes back in and, make sure that, let's get on the travel team and let's do this. And then it's this back and forth, but no one's really asking the other, is this what we want? Or the kid, I'll just go to the side that you just said. The kid is like, well, this is what my parents want me to do. This is who we are. This is the culture of our family. And then sometimes it's hard. It becomes very enmeshed. enmeshed where like you're not, the kid's like, but I don't know, this is what I do now. And again, there's no big answer in here that where it's like, well, then do this. But I think the thing is just being able to talk to your kid about where they are now, what they want. Do they enjoy this? Do they get things out of it? Because sometimes we forget to even connect to, are they experiencing joy?
So what I hear you saying is, as parents, we got to check ourselves. Is this about us? And let's just assume for a second it's not about us. And
that our kid's really
kid
driven.
just happens to be, completely fanatical about being a gym rat, playing basketball, whatever it is. I mean, there's no, to your point, sweetie, there's no like, okay, this is what you do then.
Right.
Other than like you have a discussion around it. Like, okay, help me understand why you think this is the only thing. And then like start diving in. Like, okay, what does that say about you if you think that if you blow your knee out and you can't be a football player anymore? How does that equate your value? And then you bring your own experiences into it. Like there's no perfect response to that, is there?
No, are you asking?
Yeah.
Either one.
John,
Yeah.
I'd like John to respond.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, I think you're constantly checking in. You're constantly saying, is this still the path we want to be in? A lot of parents go down this path of, well, we've already invested so much, we can't stop now, right? That this is an investment, without checking in or recognizing, oh, my kid checked out about a year and a half ago. And they've been going through the motions. And so that's the challenge. I'll give the example, like my daughter, we were talking off camera. She's going to be a senior in high school. She's looking at colleges. She could play college soccer. She doesn't want to, right? But she's known this for a while. And so, she backed off and found some other interests, but we just went to her final club soccer event, Western US Championships, a couple weeks ago. And it was awesome. And she could, she's a late birthday. So most of her teammates are graduating this year. She's got another year and she could have played another year. She's like, no, I love that team. I love that group. I'm done. Like, I just want to do other things next year. I'll play high school soccer and I'll do that. And I just think it's great that she has this sense of self that was something that she loved to do, but it wasn't her. Right. And she's like, I want to I maybe play club in college or something like that, but I don't think it's something that I want to dedicate 20 or 30 hours a week to, and yeah.
She had I love that story so much because she's like, I loved this team. I loved these people. I loved this time of life. I loved this. And now I take that skill with me, but I'm going to use it differently than the path maybe a lot of people envision, which is you got to keep climbing up, 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 up. And John, this is something I remember from, years ago with your first book. Will you, even if you don't have the exact stats, will you give us the stats about, how many kids go to college and actually play sports, and how many kids become professional? I just remember learning from you, like sometimes we kind of, so many parents say, well, my kid is going to get to school on a scholarship for their sport, but it's not that common.
Oh, it's minuscule. I mean, certainly, and it's different across sports, right? But maybe 5% of high school athletes might play a college sport. And of that, 1% might get a scholarship, and less than 1% might get a Division I scholarship. And, and depending on your sport, if it's an international sport, well, then it's even smaller because a lot of those spots are taken by international kids as well. So it's like that's got to be the cherry on top. And, and I look at, like, I had the absolute honor and pleasure of coaching my daughter's group through sort of middle school, which I think is such a hard time for girls. And this growth, and I spent so much time managing the dynamics of these kids and really talking about all these things that we wrote about in the new book here about being a great teammate and what that meant and how you treat people. Because girls at that age can get very cliquey and ostracize people and whatever. And we fought against it. And that team, after that, they got, another coach took over the last couple of years and she was amazing, but they kept that camaraderie and that friendship. And even during the high school season where these kids went to 4 different high schools, once a month they'd get together and have dinner as a team. And they would do all this stuff together. And it was just awesome. And the coach said to me, she's like, this is like the easiest group I've ever coached. But I don't think it wasn't an accident.
No.
Like there was a great group of parents whom I worked hard to shape, right? And again, they're great people, but it doesn't mean nothing ever happened. And it was a great group of kids that, we talked about things before they became big problems. And I just think this is the lesson, for coaches especially, is like, you don't just go, oh, you're so lucky, what a great parent group, or, oh, what a great group of kids. Like, some of it's luck and some of it's intentional action. And it's so important that we are intentional about these things, like teaching people to be a great teammate instead of just hoping they're going to be a good teammate.
You know what, John, like Todd and I talk a lot about, the way that we interact with people or with our kids, or the way that we talk to our kids about it. When you meet other people who do similar things, it's like you're speaking a similar language. You can talk to each other about things. You can deal with conflict. You can tell the truth. And when I'm saying these things, I'm in a compassionate, you're a good listener, all those kind of things. But when you're with people who do things differently, it's like you literally speak a different language. And what you did with that team was you taught them how to speak a similar language so they could trust each other. And then they're going to go through life being like, I know I can, because this is a big thing that, especially on a team, you have to know how to manage conflict with people in a way that you can bring something up, you can share your feelings, you can say when you're disappointed, and that person can hear it, and you can have an ongoing conversation about it where you can build trust on that. But a lot of teams, if you don't have that backbone that you gave them because you focused on belonging and, dealing with things up front, a lot of it basically, you're not speaking the same language is what I'm trying to say. Sometimes it can really be difficult. You talk about that with your in your book about certain teams that, really high profile people who actually learn a certain language and then inspire that culture within their team versus the person that comes in that's so good and they're just trying to win the game for themselves and they're not communicating with their team in the same way.
Well, he tells a story about Kobe. And I did Jerry work with Phil? Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah. So Jerry, his first book was one called Thinking Body, Dancing Mind, which became very well known in the sports world 30 years ago, right? Before there was a lot of sports psychology and stuff out there. And so it was a book that Phil made all the Bulls.
Phil Jackson.
Yeah.
Phil Jackson. Yeah. Made all the Bulls read. And then and then when he went to the Lakers, it was sort of the same thing. And so they've just been connected ever since. And it was awesome. Actually, like 2 weeks ago, Jerry and I spent 90 minutes on a Zoom with Phil Jackson, who's like an amazing guy. And we found him on his ranch in Montana and had a discussion. I mean, we're talking about the same principles that all of us are talking about here today. And he's doing it at a higher level with Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant or whatever. But selflessness versus selfishness. When's the time for each? How do I become someone who gives instead of gets, right? How can I give to my team? Humility, things like that I just think oftentimes get missed. And people like Phil Jackson or Steve Kerr, like they're very open about this, but I think people just go straight to the wins and losses, and they forget, or they don't pay attention to how much goes on behind the scenes and how much love and trust and respect there is that leads to that championship.
Well, and it's funny, you talk about, I think it's chapter 13, get uncomfortable being uncomfortable. And there's a story in there about Anson Dorrance from University of North Carolina women's soccer program once encountered Mia Hamm, the reigning player of the year and already one of the top players in the world, training by herself early one morning on a hot, humid summer day. As he watched, she pushed herself through sprint after sprint, falling to the ground, gasping for breath after each. It made me think, because I remember I was lucky enough to go see a New England Patriots practice during preseason. And after the practice was over, everybody went in. And this is when Tom Brady was still on the Patriots. And he was the last one on the field doing drills.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, and this is after he's already won 4 or 5 Super Bowls. And I'm just like, nobody ever sees it. Nobody ever talks about it. But that's what puts them in their place. We just think that Mia Hamm and Tom Brady and Kobe Bryant and Michael Jordan were just super talented.
Showed up that way,
which
right?
they were.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no way you can be that. And also without that discipline in it. So now, how do we shift that lesson into parenting? Like, because parenting is freaking hard as any other sport that anybody's ever played. So I just wonder if you can take that story that you told in the book and shift it into parenting.
I mean, that's a great question. I think, I mean, parenting is getting comfortable being uncomfortable, right? That you are constantly in situations where you're like, oh man, this is a tough one. What do I do? I think having a trusted relationship, whether you're, still married and with your spouse, I mean, there's so many things that my wife and I like, okay, like, let's talk about this before we make a decision. And we're pretty good at saying to our kids, let me talk to your mom. Let me talk to your dad. Right. And then of course they try to do the end around. Right. And then you're like, like we talk, yeah. we communicate. Right. So, what are the things, and, what are the things that, like, I'm going to stake my flag and say, this I will not bend and compromise on versus that. But I think, you give examples of, I think sport's cool because we all sort of have some sort of relationship where we understand these things and we understand people, and that people who do things well put in more time than others.
Well,
right.
For me,
yeah.
It's when I guess I'm answering my own question. It's like, put in the reps. And what the reps is, we're going back to E plus R equals O, is do I have the discipline to not get reactive when our kid comes in just mad at the world or mad at a friend or mad at me? And that's for me. So, sweetie,
well, I wanted to add to this is that something like it, because I'm like seeing the frame, and I like want to move the frame over to our kids when they love something, and when it comes from, like, it's in alignment with who they are, they have more of an ability to give the Mia Hamm, Tom Brady thing. If we have a child and we say, you're going to play soccer and I want you to give what Mia Hamm gives, our kids may not have that because that's not their dream. Because I've watched with my own kids where they've picked up things and I've been like, oh, this is going to be so good. They're going to love this, or they have a natural talent for this. And then they just are not putting in what you would think they would, like you've got kind of like a road here, take that road. But then they find something on their own, and you see them doing it in their room late at night, or you see them spending 2 hours, figuring out this little part of it. And it's because it's coming from inside. So John, you've already spoke to this, but knowing your kid is such a big, if your dream is for them to do this sport and do it well, it may not look the way they may not be Mia Hamm,
Well, and I think it's important when it comes to sport, most people don't have any inside knowledge of what a Kobe Bryant did or a Mia Hamm did or an Abby Wambach did. They have no idea. And oftentimes we often call things talent, which is just ability. And the younger our kid is, that ability is so often just completely dependent on when they were born.
Yeah.
What month of the year, right? So the kid who's born in January, and January 1's the cutoff for the baseball or the soccer team. If your kid's born in January, he or she is almost always going to be labeled as, quote, more talented than the kid born in November. And they're just 11 months older. And it makes a huge difference when they're young. And we call this relative age in sport. And so we really don't know. And Tom Brady, again, is the perfect example, right? Like, if arguably the greatest football player of all time at age 23 had 167 teams say, nah, we're not going to pick him, right? The idea that we can identify talent at age 6 or 7 or 8, it's absurd, right? And so what I'd say is talent is really ability plus these psychological characteristics, like gritty resilience and integrity and all these things that help get you there. That's what true talent is. Most people have no idea. And so I think our job as parents really is or my belief is help your kids find their passion instead of trying to determine it for them.
So I'm going to jump over to the leadership section, part 3 and chapter 24. The reason I love your book, John, is most of the quotes come from like Maya Angelou and John Kabat-Zinn and Mother Teresa. You got some Dean Smith and Phil Jackson in there too, but it's a lot of the people that Cathy and I kind of try our best to emulate ourselves after. So I'm just going to read the 2 quotes that start with the Learn to Serve chapter, and it's from Maya Angelou. What you're supposed to do when you don't like a thing is change it. If you can't change it, change the way you think about it. Don't complain. And then John Kabat-Zinn says, you can't stop the waves, but you can learn to surf. And I'm wondering if you can just reshare the story, because Abby Wambach is somebody who Cathy and I were lucky enough to meet because she came to one of our conferences. But you have a story in the book about Abby and how she learned to surf. Would you mind sharing that?
This is one of my favorite stories in the book because it epitomizes, I think, so much, and there's so much to learn. And so the story is obviously, for any of your listeners who don't know, Abby Wambach's one of the greatest female players of all time, multiple-time World Player of the Year, World Cup, Olympic champion. I mean, the accolades go on and on. But in 2019, U.S. women are in the World Cup. 2019? No, 2015. Yeah, 2015. They're in the World Cup. The coach of the team pulls Abby aside, says, "You're no longer gonna start. Right? You're gonna come off the bench." And as Abby talks about, like, she was just heartbroken, absolutely devastated. Like, this is it. This is the final event of my career. I'm gonna retire after. Now I'm on the bench. I've never been on the bench my entire life. I'm the World Player of the Year. I'm this. I'm that. And she said she was so angry and mad and crying and upset and calling her loved ones and all that. And then she said, and then I sort of thought about it, and like, this moment right here is going to define my career. How I respond, not react. I'm reacting now, which is okay. I'm reacting privately, but how I respond to this is going to be what I'm remembered for. And she decided to respond by being an amazing teammate and coming off the bench and supporting those on the field, right? And I mean, I think she talks about how Jill Ellis was like, "I got to sub you in because you're annoying the heck out of me right now," like yelling in my ear. But and she talks about how, like, so many of her teammates that are close from that team remember that was a defining moment for them too, right? If the best player ever, arguably, can react to or respond to getting benched this way, how can I do things differently? And I just think it's just an amazing story, because that's the lesson, right, that we need to all teach our kids, right? So, okay, you're on the bench. Now what? You're going to become petulant and selfish and cut the legs out from the coach and the team, and as the parent, are you going to intervene or whatever? Or are you going to say, what did Abby do in this situation? She became a great teammate, and yeah, so I absolutely love that story. And I know that Abby looks at that as like, that was one of the defining moments of her life right there.
So, I think we maybe have 15 minutes left, and I got a bunch of questions I still want to ask, but I want to make sure, sweetie, that you get your chance to ask anything, or I can keep going.
No, I just wanted to add to that story because I love that story too. And I think, I've heard Abby tell that story. And what I love about it, which you also shared, John, was that she was upset initially, and she said she went to the locker room and was throwing things around and was pissed off. But then, like you said, she called people. It's not about not having the emotion. Mm-hmm. It's about what you're gonna do next. And that's like, I think, and this is a parenting thing. Sometimes we see our kid react in a certain way. They get angry, they get sad. And for us to say, don't be sad or don't be angry, to shut that down versus I get it. And then then helping them understand how to, that's the whole thing about being emotionally agile is, what are you going to do with that energy? You are angry, but how are you going to use it? And
if you weren't angry, there'd be something wrong with you.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, it means you care. Yes. Congratulations. Welcome to being human. Like, you care, you're nervous, you're stressed, you're angry. You just want to do something. Fantastic. But it doesn't mean that, but then what I do in that moment, I can go, the road diverges and I can go in two different directions, and one's going to be helpful and one's not.
Yep.
Well, that's what I've been saying forever. And I'm good at preaching it. I'm probably not that good at practicing it. All emotions are good if channeled in a positive way. Some people call positive and negative emotions. I don't subscribe to that. There's comfortable and uncomfortable emotions. And when my kid shows up after a long day with uncomfortable emotions, it tends to bring uncomfortable emotions up to me. But my hope is that I can hold the space for whatever happens to be bubbling up in their system and not shut it down. It's so easy for us parents to try to shut it down, and it's got nothing to do with them. It's just because I don't feel like feeling this right now. So instead of me dealing with my reaction to this, I'm just going to shut yours down so I can go on with my business as usual.
Well, and then that thing, and this is kind of an obvious thing, but then everything that Abby felt, she used on that bench: embarrassment, rage, disappointment, whatever.
Sadness.
That's what allowed her to scream and yell and say, come on, I got you. Like, she chose the love path, but it was all that energy she was releasing, was from those initial foundational emotions, which were, because she said it was embarrassing. It was all these things, but use it. That's, so anyway, thank you, John, for putting that in your book, because I think that's a powerful one.
Chapter 19, Sweep the Shed. Quick story. I went to go see the All Blacks play the U.S. rugby team at Soldier Field one time. And I don't know, 4 minutes in the game, it was 7-6. I'm like, I might be getting the scoring wrong. I don't know how rugby scores, but I'm like, oh, we're in this. And then we lost 97-6. So, that gives you a quick example of how good the All Blacks are at rugby. And I'm wondering why you put them in the Sweeping the Shed chapter. What do they do?
Sweep the Shed is sort of a mantra of the All Blacks. There's a wonderful book called Legacy by a guy named James Kerr about sort of the culture of the All Blacks. And, the All Blacks in the era of professional sports are the winningest team, right? The highest winning percentage. And this culture was really based on a lot of things. Number one, you don't own the shirt. You're just a custodian of it for a while, and you need to leave it in a better place for the next guy who comes after you. And number two, the idea that in order to be great, you have to be humble. You can never be too big to do all the little things. And so the way that the All Blacks remind themselves of that is that after every game they play, the coaches are done, the media's gone, the 80,000 fans leave Soldier Field, the All Blacks players sweep the locker room. So they clean up the dirt and the mud and the tape and everything, and they leave the locker room better than they got it, right? And that's not like, oh, hey, brand new player, here's the broom. That's the team captain picks it up first. Right. And I absolutely love that idea. And when I walk into a college locker room, oftentimes, and I look around, right, if it's an absolute pigsty, I'm like, and what other details are you missing? Right. What else are we missing here? Right. What are the other things that you can't be bothered to do that you might get away with some days? But when it comes down to the finest margins of winning a championship, you haven't done them. And I can just see it in your locker room. And so I think that it's such a important thing. I was working with Rutgers field hockey, and in 2021, we ended up being the number one team in the country. We won the Big Ten. It was the first Rutgers team to ever win a Big Ten championship. And people are like, how'd you know you were there that year? And I was like, I was there in preseason, and we had a team meal, and I was sitting with the coaches and the head strength coach for the school. And we were in the student athletic center. And at the end of the meal, the kids got up. No one asked them to. They cleaned up, they wiped down the tables, they boxed up the food, they made a box of food for the strength coach to bring home to his kids. They tucked in the chairs and said, we'll see you at practice tomorrow. And the coach looked at sort of us and goes, I've been here 25 years. I've never seen a team do that before. Right. They just expect someone to pick up after them. Right. And I was like, yeah, that's it. We're there. Mm-hmm. Right. We're there. And I talked to that to my kids. And again, it's led by a coach as well. Like, if I see a piece of tape on the ground or an empty plastic bottle, I might say to a kid, hey, can you make sure we clean up before we leave? But I can't just kick it out of the way and walk away. Like, I got to pick it up too. Yeah. And I think if you model that, you're great.
Yeah. I was going to say modeling is the number one way that I try my best to parent, is by modeling the behavior I want to see in the kids. Mm-hmm. So, and the reason I love those stories is because entitlement, I think I still have some of my own work to do around entitlement, because entitlement drives me up a wall. And the two stories you just shared are the opposite of that. And I just am inspired by that. And I just know, because I get so grumpy around what I perceive to be entitlement, that there's still some entitled me that I need to kind of figure out and process through. So I just love those two stories. The last thing I want to share, and I think it can relate to parenting really well, is a chapter on Pet the Dragons. Can you explain what that means? And then I'll kind of ask a parent, I'll just, I guess, make a parenting comment around it. What is Pet the Dragons?
Well, for those, all the parents who listen to your podcast, there's a great children's book called There's No Such Thing as a Dragon. Jack Kent, I think, is the author. And it's a simple story. About a little kid who wakes up in the morning and sees this cute little dragon, and he pets the dragon, and then he goes downstairs and he tells his mom, and she says, there's no such thing as a dragon. And next thing you know, the dragon gets a little bigger. And throughout the day, the mom and then eventually the dad keep saying there's no such thing as a dragon. And every time they do, the dragon gets bigger, and then it eventually takes over the house and runs away with the house. And at the very end, they finally acknowledge, little Billy's like, but there is a dragon. And the parents acknowledge it, and the dragon gets small and cute again. Right. And I think, when we look at most of the children's stories that we read to our kids, there's a lot of valuable life lessons in there. And that one is that when you don't acknowledge small things, they become big things in your marriage, in your relationships, on your team, whatever it is. And so I love that story. And it's funny to walk into like a Division I locker room and read and pull out a kid's book, and they're like, who the heck is this guy? And read that. But people get it. And every locker room, every family has dragons. Yeah. And if you acknowledge them and talk to them and deal with it, and it's going to be difficult, and there might be tears, but if we stick our head in the sand, it's not going away. Mm-hmm. And so it's funny, because a couple of these teams, like, I will buy them like a little stuffed dragon, and it just sits in the locker room. Mm-hmm. Right. And I'll come in and be like, all right, have we been petting the dragon? Right. Or is this thing ripping the locker room apart right now? And it's just a great metaphor for sport and teams and life. And, yeah, and it's a cute story too.
Sweetie, what do you think of that?
I love it. I mean, that is, and I wrote it down because I obviously am going to, and I'm going to give you full credit, and I'm going to give the book full credit. But this is what I talk to families about all the time when it comes to, you talk about messy conversations with girls, and as they're growing up, and obviously it's not gender specific, but just because I'm always talking about the specific things they're dealing with. But that you have confronting, like allowing when they say there's something to say, you see it too, and that you are there with them, and that we're going to talk about it, and we're not going to put it in a corner, and that we're going to ask questions, and then we're going to listen, like all the willingness to keep that dragon cute and small, rather than it becomes so big that we can no longer even see each other anymore. It devours us, because there's like it goes so far the other way.
Well, for me, it's just like, I mean, whether it's a family or an intimate relationship, like if we're not dealing with the stuff, it's not going away.
I know.
And I've never heard that. I've never heard of that children's book, but I love it. And it's such a wonderful reminder of how to be in relationship with anybody.
And petting the dragon, especially when you're talking to teams about them, that's what brings them closer. Like this is the thing about that people don't understand about conflict is the word. It's almost like we have to come up with a new word, because that's what actually brings us closer, but we avoid it, or we don't talk about it, so we get further away. So it's like this paradoxical thing where it's uncomfortable, but that's the way we actually create intimacy and connection. And you use this word in your book a lot, belonging. Can I bring my whole self here? That's I have like, I like have so many chapters from your book. Just like, I'm like rereading them, because can I bring my whole self here, or am I hiding, all these aspects of who I am? So I just love the idea. So will you say something about belonging really quick?
Yeah, sure. And I think, the way we wrote the book is, as you guys have seen, right, they're short. They're like 3-page chapters, right? And the idea behind that is, it was written for high school teams and college teams and middle school teams and stuff. It was written for the parent who says, like, you know what, let me get this book for my kid because I want my son or daughter to be a better teammate. But it was also written for the coach who says, I need 20. We're going to read this as a team, right? We need to do this. Or maybe we'll just do a chapter a week, right? And we'll spend 15 minutes one day a week, and we'll go through it. And at the end of each, short chapter, we have this section called Optimize Your Performance. And it's a place to write in the book and write your answers down, and then discuss as a team, so that when these dragons come up, like, you have a discussion about them, and what do you need to start doing? What do you need to stop doing? What do we need to keep doing, to be better in these areas? And not every team needs the same thing. Right. And when you do that, right, when you have those discussions, when people have a voice, when you get to speak up, when you acknowledge what's wrong, you have what we call psychological safety. Yes. Right? And then psychological safety is what research shows is the key to high performing teams. That people can speak up, they're not shut down, they're not embarrassed, they're not humiliated. And I think when you have high levels of psychological safety, you have high levels of belonging. You have high levels of people feeling like this is a group that I want to be a part of. We don't see everything eye to eye, but we can disagree respectfully, and we can agree to pursue a thing, even if it's not my favorite path of action, because the group thinks this, and my ideas matter. I think one of the most important topics we teach in there that we didn't really cover here, it's an acronym, and we call it the river, right? And the river being when you make people feel relevant, when you make them feel important, when you validate them, when you empower them, and when you respect them, you get their very best. And teams with belonging do that. Great coaches do that. Great parents do that. That even when I'm disagreeing or saying no, I can still do it with respect. I can still give you a voice. I can still validate your opinion and make you feel important and relevant. And, when you do that, you build that trust and that connection, and that's when people perform their best.
I think that's a great place to stop. John, if anybody's out there and either wants to buy your book or listen to your podcast, just go ahead and promote anything you want to.
Yeah, I mean, the book's on Amazon right now. It's out in hardcover. We decided to self-publish this one so we could, do bulk orders cheaper and get them to coaches cheaper. It'll be on all platforms here at the end of August, when we release a paperback version. My website's changingthegameproject.com. And that's kind of the mothership where you can find the Wave Champions podcast and our blogs and videos and my TED Talk and all that other fun stuff. So that's a great way to sort of connect. And if you like this, I mean, you can reach out to me, John, JOHN at changingthegameproject.com is a great way to sort of, if you have any questions or whatever, and say, hey, heard you on the, Todd and Cathy's podcast. Like, awesome. It'd be great to hear from you.
Sweet. All right, sweetie, any closing thoughts?
No, just that I love your books, John, and I love your work. And, like we said at the beginning, a lot of what we learned from you years and years and years ago, we still use. And I always direct people to your work. So thank you for doing what you do in the world. And it's making a big difference.
All right,
awesome.
We will see you on next week's episode of Zen Parenting Radio. Where's my outro music? I forgot to play a funny clip, but it's all right. We'll do that.
Oh boy.
It was Allen Iverson. I'll play it anyways.
Practice.
We're talking about practice, not a game. We're talking about practice, man. I mean, how silly is that?
Yeah.
So it's so famous because that's what it is all about? Is that what he's saying?
No, you want to give the context around that, John? Do you remember the context?
I mean, I don't remember exactly what was happening that brought that up, except I think he got suspended for skipping practice or behavior in practice. And he was just basically trying to tell the world practice doesn't matter. And obviously Allen Iverson was a supremely talented basketball player who probably wasn't as good as he could have been if he was maybe a little more serious about practice.
Boom.
Interesting. Oh, I love ending on that. That's great.
Okay. Well, now I got to go back to my outro music. All right. John O'Sullivan, you are awesome. Thank you so much. We'll definitely connect again. Zen Parenting Radio listeners, thanks for joining us. See you next week.